Hello, Facebook, YouTube, and beyond. I'm Femi OK.
And I'm Malika Bilal. We're in Washington, D.C., monitoring the U.S. presidential election unfolding outside our studio and across the United States today.
For the next half hour, we're discussing voting rights. Every American citizen has the right to vote, but for many, it's not that easy.
So coming up, a voting rights expert and reporter covering election irregularities join us. But first, a look at what's trending on social media platforms around the world. As highly anticipated as the election is here in the United States, the world is watching too. So in Germany, take a look, one woman tweeted she's scared about the future, not only for the U.S., but for the entire world. In Mexico, Aqua Mike, that's his name, highlights the stakes, saying you have to pay attention to local politics as well as the American elections. And in China, one Weibo user just wants this all to be over, wishing the U.S. good luck today.
Now, if Hillary Clinton wins the election, she will become the first female president of the United States. That's a huge step forward in history from 1920, when women first gained the right to vote. From the first black woman elected to Congress in 1968, that's Shirley Chisholm, to former Democratic vice presidential candidate Geraldine Ferraro, women have worn white to honor suffragettes on Election Day.
But some people on Twitter are trying to fill a gap in history they say overlooks the black women unable to vote until 1965. That's 45 years after white women gained the right. Take a look at this tweet from Kelly, who says, if you're going to channel the suffragists, at least acknowledge how much they denied access to women of color, black women.
Not only are some people wearing white to vote, but many Hillary Clinton supporters, in homage to her iconic outfits, are planning to wear pantsuits to the polls today. Have a look at this.
I could never do those moves in a pantsuit. Now, earlier this week, Twitter users cried foul after many alleged Trump supporters were accused of spreading misinformation about voting. So images like this one informing people they could text in their vote were taken down. Now, Twitter came out to tell people you can't text in your vote, but you can stay informed and send questions by tweeting @gov.
Despite that, people are still tweeting out false information. Just this morning, Joe Keane flagged tweets like this one, urging Clinton supporters to text their vote.
We'll be monitoring what's happening online all day. Share your experiences with us using #StreamElects.
Covering an election takes enormous resources, and journalists are stretched even further trying to verify claims of voter fraud and election rigging. In an unprecedented move, 400 newsrooms across the United States teamed up to uncover barriers and hoaxes in a project called Electionland. The New York-based journalism nonprofit ProPublica started the project. With us to talk about today's election, we have Jessica Huseman. She is a ProPublica senior reporter fellow on Electionland. Jessica, it's great to have you there. I see the newsroom busy behind you. Thanks for taking time out for us. I did not think I would be starting with a tweet about Urban Outfitters. You called them out. You called them out on your Twitter feed earlier today. Let me just show everybody the tweet that upset you. So Urban Outfitters, they're a clothing store, and basically what they did a day ago was to say, hey guys, this is what you need to do, your handy voting guide reference, and then you were not happy with that. Why?
No, we were not happy with it. It gave incorrect information. For example, it said that you needed to have an ID to vote. That's actually not true in a lot of states. It had a lot of other incorrect information in there as well. Fortunately, as soon as we flagged that to Urban Outfitters this morning, they removed the tweet and then corrected the voting guide. But it was probably a little too late for some people to see. Needless to say, you should probably not rely on clothing stores for your voter guide information. States put these out. They're much better resources for that sort of thing.
What it does speak to, Jessica, is that enthusiasm in social media for this election, for people wanting to take part, to join in, to share their thoughts. Is that helpful, or is it hurting voter rights?
Yeah, I mean, the participation in social media has been really excellent. You know, most of what we're seeing is people doing legitimate get out the vote efforts, people excited to tweet about the election. But then we do see, as you pointed out earlier in this live stream, people tweeting things that aren't necessarily true on social media, and we're trying to catch as many of those as we can. Twitter was not great at the very beginning when these tweets started to come up, but now they're flagging them more and more often, and that's a great improvement.
One of the first stories that I saw from you this morning was about broken voting machines, and the headline was like, no biggie, why?
Well, you know, I think that there are about 100,000 voting machines in the United States right now, and we've only received a report of, you know, a few dozen precincts that are having problems like this. There are a couple of cities where the problems are bigger than others, but, you know, this is kind of what we expect to see when you're talking about machines that are pretty old. The majority of voting machines in the United States are the age of the first iPad, and, you know, you don't keep iPads that long because they break. And the same is true with voting machines, and so we expect to see problems on voting day. Precincts are prepared for this. There are always hard copy paper ballots as backups, and if it's a scanning machine, if it's a lot of polling places have bubble ballots, and then you put them through a scanner, and we've seen some reports that those scanners are broken this morning. But all you have to do is put your ballot inside a secured box, and then it will be scanned later when they bring in a replacement. So really, this shouldn't. This might delay people for a little while, but they should still be able to vote in every precinct.
I can see, I've got a really good view of your colleagues' laptops. I can see basically they're on Twitter. But what else are you doing? How are you monitoring today's election?
Yeah, you know, we're also looking at Facebook and Instagram, and that's mostly what the students are doing. They're monitoring social media for us, and we've got 14 journalism schools across the country doing that authentication and finding tweets and making sure that they're real. But we also have access to the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights call-in data. They monitor several states for voting irregularities, and people can call them if they need help casting a ballot. And so we have access to all of their data, so we know what problems they're seeing across the country. And then we can also field text from people. So if you text election land to 69866, you can tell us about your voting issues, and we've got data from that as well. So we're combining social media, the Lawyers Committee data, and that texting data into one huge package. And so this is the kind of thing we're sending to reporters. So when reporters on the ground, there are 400 of them, as you mentioned earlier, get these tips from us, they're well packaged, they are complete with sources that they can call immediately. And so we're hoping that this helps them kind of speed up the process of reporting very quickly on election day.
So you're asking people, tell us your stories, you're at the polls, DM us, you're asking them, reaching out via social media. What are you hearing so far that made you go, wasn't expecting that?
Sure. You know, I mean, I think that the good news is that everything that we've heard today, we were kind of expecting to hear. There's nothing crazy happening at the polls right now. I think there are a lot of people really concerned about voter intimidation, for example, and we've heard from people even before the election that they were scared to go out and vote because they were afraid that they might be hassled. We're really not seeing widespread reports of that. The very few that we have been seeing across the country appear to be individual instances that were dealt with quickly by local officials in the vast majority of cases. There is, as I'm speaking to you now, no apparent massive national organization, a system behind voter intimidation like some feared that there would be. So that's great. And then the other problems that we're seeing, like long lines and broken polling machines, we expected to see those, and we're reporting on them as we knew we would. But we haven't seen anything yet that surprised us, and that's good news.
One of the things you're doing as Electionlander, as a group of journalists and reporters, is helping people know more about the election process. So one of the stories that's just right up there on the Electionland website is about why you might have to vote using a provisional ballot. Do you want to explain that? Because that might be a bit of a shock. You go to vote and then you have to have a provisional ballot. Why?
Yeah, sure. There are a lot of reasons that you might need to cast a provisional ballot. And the most common will be that if you're registered to vote and you show up to your assigned polling location and they don't have you in the roll book, they'll ask you to fill out a provisional ballot. You'll fill out the provisional ballot, and as soon as they can make sure that you were registered to vote, then your ballot is counted. So being asked to cast a provisional ballot does mean that something might have gone wrong, but it does not mean that you're not getting to vote or that your vote counts any less than someone who can vote normally on election day. In voter ID states, if you come come to the polls without the correct ID. As long as you're registered, you can vote provisionally and then present your ID at a determined location later. And then, there are also a lot of other reasons people might have to cast a provisional ballot. If something goes wrong, or if the polls are if the roll book is out of date, then that's also true. But you should also be aware that there are several states that are considered full rejection states. And what that means is if you are at the wrong precinct and you cast a ballot, and they determine later that you were in fact at the wrong precinct, they will throw your entire ballot out. So if you live in a full rejection state, and that information is linked in the post that you just referenced, then you should make absolutely sure that you're at the right polling location before you cast any ballot at all.
All right, Jessica, if people have something to report, they're at a polling station, I know you know this off by heart, what should they do?
So they should do a couple of things. If it's an immediate need and you're not being able to vote, then you should definitely call the lawyers committee before you call us. They're going to be able to help you right away. We're going to be able to get media presence there, and we should definitely do that. But if you call 1-866-OUR-VOTE, then a lawyer can help you right away and give you advice on what you should do. And then you should text us. You can text Electionland to 69866. or tweet at us at Electionland, and we will help you get media resources out to that location in the hopes that a little bit of media pressure might change the situation.
Jessica Huseman is a ProPublica senior reporting fellow on Electionland. Get back to work. Thank you, Jessica. Take care. And now, we wouldn't be live here and online doing our stream election coverage without you being part of that conversation. We will do that via Malika Bilal back at the desk.
Welcome, Facebook and YouTube. Now to talk about voting rights, Nicole Alston-Hillary is here next to me. She's the director and counsel of the Washington, D.C. office of the Brennan Center for Justice. Our audiences have lots of questions. We know that one of the biggest stories about this election is that this is the first national federal election to occur since the Supreme Court struck down a key provision of the Voting Rights Act and really gutted it, is what people say. Okay. Explain for our audience what that means. The stream did a show on it, so I know some of our audience already knows, but for those who don't know, in our international audience, what does that mean? Why is that important?
Sure. When the Voting Rights Act was enacted in 1965, what it did was it focused on states that had a history of discrimination in voting. So for those states, and in some instances jurisdictions, even parts of the state of New York, where that history was prevalent, the Voting Rights Act required that any time those jurisdictions wanted to make changes to their voting laws and requirements, they had to have those changes okayed, if you will, by either the Department of Justice or the highest federal court of appeals in the District of Columbia. But when the Supreme Court struck down that section of the Voting Rights Act on June 25th of 2013,
I
and
love it. She knows the date.
It's embedded. It's embedded.
Yeah.
In a case called Shelby County versus Holder, the Supreme Court basically said, you no longer can force these jurisdictions to come to the Department of Justice or to the highest federal court in the District of Columbia to get permission when they want to make voting changes. So that therefore meant it was a free-for-all. Any of those jurisdictions could make any changes to their voting laws and did not have to have the imprimatur of the federal government behind them. And we saw on that very day when that decision came down, in the state of Texas, for instance, their Secretary of State that very day got in front of news cameras and said, now we're going to move forward with our voter ID law, and we're going to enact it because we no longer have to have the okay of the federal government.
So does that explain why we are seeing headlines like this? This is the week. Take a look at my laptop here. This is the headline. This is an opinion article. This is the first election without the full Voting Rights Act, and it's already a disaster. In your opinion, has this been disastrous? This lead up to voter IDs, whether or not people need them, confusion?
Here's what I will tell you, what we've seen. Because of this change in the Voting Rights Act, we have had to, and when I say we, I mean voting rights organizations like the Brennan Center, have spent a great deal of time litigating cases against jurisdictions that have tried to enact laws that we think would have a chilling effect on voters, that we think would make it harder for a huge swath of voters to actually register to vote and engage in the elections process. And particularly those voters that are considered vulnerable, minority groups, the elderly, students, poor communities. So what we've seen is that we've had to really fight hard to try to protect the interest of those voters. I'm happy to say that since 2013, we've been successful in beating back many of those attempts by so many states. What we see today on Election Day is that there are 14 states that have new laws in place that change voting as those voters knew it prior to changes in the Voting Rights Act. So there are states where there are new rules and regulations in place, but we've been very successful in tamping down on those. So for instance, even in states where there are voter ID laws, like the Commonwealth of Virginia, those are less draconian voter ID laws than what we were seeing that might have been in place had lawyers on the ground and in national organizations not been fighting back against them. And what we've seen is that federal courts have said when they look at many of those challenges to some of those new laws like voter ID, those courts have been able to say, like for instance in North Carolina, we see that this is a concerted effort to make it harder for black voters, for instance, to vote. That is unconstitutional. That is not permissible in the United States. And those courts were not allowing that. So those courts have in some instances said voter ID is okay, but only okay when it is not targeted at specific voters. So in Virginia, again, going back to that example, that state has made it possible for voters to get free IDs. They've tried to make it possible for those voters to do so in a way that it's not hard for them to get those IDs. So even if you have issues with voter ID, you do want to see that states where they have them are not making it hard for voters to get those IDs so that as many voters as possible can get the requisite ID and can come out and vote.
Well, of course, this is a Facebook Live and it is a Know Your Rights segment. So if you have questions, if you have things that are happening to you, concerns, you're at the polls, you're in line, keep your questions coming via Facebook, via YouTube. We'll pose them here to our guests, Nicole, Austin, Hillary of the Brennan Center. I want to share with you what some people online are sharing. And this is the very long line. So here's a member of our team. This is Omar Badar, member of the stream team. Election line so long this morning, I had time to lapse it. So you can see this is hyperlapse. This is here in Washington, D.C. I mean, on the one hand, this is excitement. Everyone wants to come out to vote. On the other hand, you have people saying, actually, what this means is that I was in line for 90 minutes in New York. This is Louise. Even though I got there at 6:30 a.m., there was a sense of patriotism and hopefulness there. But those long lines aren't okay. This is an article from Vox saying this is wrong. This should not happen.
Well, I will tell you, I am buoyed by the fact that so many voters are enthusiastic and are getting out there and are participating in our democracy. On the flip side, long lines is a big concern. Look, if we go back to 2012, right after the 2012 election, President Obama instituted a commission that he called the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. And this was a nonpartisan body. It consisted of, actually, it was headed by the lawyers who represented George W. Bush and Al Gore during their elections. It had lawyers from the McCain campaign. So it was a nonpartisan effort. But what they did was they looked to see what are the kinds of changes that jurisdictions can make to make it easier for voters to participate in our democracy. And one of their biggest issues was long lines. And they made many recommendations as to how we could cut down on long lines. In fact, they even studied the Walt Disney Company because they said if anybody knows how to deal with long lines, it's the Walt Disney Company.
That's the happiest place on earth.
Exactly, because people wait in long lines. So what we've seen is that some states across the country have adopted those recommendations, but by and large, most states have not. We at the Brennan Center urge states to take a look at that report, to take a look at the report we did at the Brennan Center. We did a report on long lines and made recommendations for things that jurisdictions could do to try to cut down on those long lines.
It's too late for today.
It is too late for today, but as I've been reminding people all day, the fight for democracy doesn't end after November 8th. It continues. So we've got to continue to look at reforms that will make it easier for voters to engage in our democracy. Dealing with the long lines is one of those big issues. So I am hopeful that states will continue to look at what can we do to tamp down on long lines so that voters are not spending hours and hours waiting in lines. But we're also encouraging states to also look at things like instituting early voting, instituting voting on the weekend before the election. In mechanisms like that help to cut down on long lines and ensure that we're getting as many voters as possible.
I voted early here in D.C. I was expecting a very long line. I walked in, it was a breeze. It was perfect. So thank you, Washington, D.C. All right, so we're going to do this rapid fire because there are a lot of questions coming in, so I'll just kind of throw them at you. This is via Twitter. Rachel says, lots of talk online about voter intimidation at the polls. What can people do if faced with the opposition to vote?
As your previous guest said, they can call the 1-866-OUR-VOTE hotline. The Brennan Center, as well as many other civil rights organizations, are engaged working with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law to deal with questions that voters have. We have lawyers like myself who are manning those hotlines. We have lawyers on the ground who are on the ready to be dispatched, if need be, to deal with issues that they might have to show up in court to deal with on Election Day. So if voters are experiencing any issues, they should call 1-866-OUR-VOTE. They should also go and talk to the elections officials on the ground at their polling places. These are wonderfully trained individuals who are really primed to deal with Election Day issues. What we were seeing earlier today for calls coming into 1-866-OUR-VOTE is that when voters were dealing with any kind of potential intimidation, those elections officials on the ground were able to deal with them immediately and get rid of those issues. So voters should feel free to talk to those officials on the ground and to call the 1-866-OUR-VOTE hotline.
Okay, you heard it here first. All right, here's another one. Ballot selfies. A look at where they are allowed or not. A lot of people online asking if they can take pictures. The Washington Post here has a list of, it varies by state, so a list of states where you can or cannot. I want to show you something that is in the news today. So this is Eric Trump, the son of, candidate Donald Trump. He tweeted a picture of his ballot, even though it's been shown to be illegal in New York. Actually, our previous guest, her election land homepage has this post here. He deletes the ballot picture after we pointed it out. They tweeted that out. It has been deleted. But if people want to take a picture of themselves saying that they voted, how do they make sure that that's okay? Should they just not?
Actually, what they should do is they should ask the polling officials who are on site. Those are people who have been trained to know what the rules and regulations are governing that particular jurisdiction, and they can tell them whether that is permissible. Again, they can also call the 1-866-OUR-VOTE hotline because we have access to information governing all the jurisdictions across the country. We have people that are particularly assigned to one state versus another, and they should be able to tell them what is permissible in their jurisdiction.
Perfect. All right, here's another one. This is from Kara. What are the options if voters with disabilities experience inaccessibility at the polls?
I'm so glad to get a question about voters with disabilities because they're such an important part of our electorate, and we do know that many states still have a lot of work to do to ensure that those voters have easy access to the polls. Again, we have lawyers who are specifically focused on what to do with respect to disability issues. They should call 1-866-OUR-VOTE.
Before they even get to the polls?
Before they even get to the polls, they can call 1-866-OUR-VOTE, and we will tell them what is available in their particular jurisdiction, what kinds of options are available to them if they need assistance. And there is assistance that states are required to provide for those voters who have a disability. So they definitely should go to the polls armed with that information, and the best way to do that is to call the 1-866-OUR-VOTE hotline.
Okay. Here's Dead Susie. This person, I think, is being a little bit sarcastic, but who knows? It's still an interesting statement. Telling authority figures what your rights are is a great way to get arrested in a lot of places. And, you know, there's skepticism there, but it might be coming from a place of authenticity. What do you say to people who say, well, you know, I'm afraid to tell people this is my right. I heard it here on the stream. I heard it on Facebook. I've heard it from the Brennan Center. What do they do when they get into an altercation or they get in front of someone who says, no, you can't do this, or you're not allowed to do this, or you can't vote here?
If they run into an altercation, and they shouldn't be, the officials on the ground should be very well versed on what the rights and responsibilities are of voters. If they run into an issue with a particular elections official, one, there are many elections officials on the ground. They should go and talk to someone else. If you've done that and you still are running into issues, again, I cannot stress enough how well equipped the lawyers who are manning the election protection hotline are. Not only are we equipped to deal with questions and issues over the phone, we are equipped to dispatch lawyers in real time who are on the ground in places where the voters are located.
Are they just huddled in a coffee shop, just waiting?
They're not huddled in a coffee shop. We have command centers across the country. In most instances, law firms that have volunteered their space are providing rooms and technology so that lawyers can be on the ready. So that's what they should do. They should call that hotline, and we will be more than happy to help them.
Okay. So before Election Day, our team spoke with some people who have had in the past some trouble voting, and that includes ex-felons. That also includes members of the transgender community. We did a whole infographic here on our website. You can check it out at stream.aljazeera.com. Barriers to the ballot. We spoke to several people who talked about their difficulties. One in particular that I'm going to pose to you. This is Vani Ram, a transgender woman who talks about how hard it is for her, or was for her, just to even get the ID to vote. Here's what she told us.
So one of my main barriers is that I'm a trans woman of color. So there's some specific barriers in terms of being able to get your ID that would accurately reflect your gender marker. So I had to show a letter from my psychiatrist and my primary physician who said that, I've done the necessary steps and followed all of the processes to live as a woman now, and I can change all of my documents. A lot of poll workers, turn people away, if they find any kind of discrepancy and aren't really aware or kind of literate of, the issues that trans people face in terms of their ID and in terms of their marker. And, therefore, they turn a lot of people away. I know.
So voting while trans, it sounds like the answer is probably going to be what you said earlier when people are facing difficulties at the polls, but do you have anything in particular to say to people whose gender might not match their ID, who've had difficulties, making sure that was squared away before Election Day?
Yes. First of all, those voters should not be experiencing problems if they took the requisite steps to make sure that they were adhering with their local jurisdictions' laws and regulations. But if they do run into issues, aside from calling the hotline, they should be asking to cast a provisional ballot. Because a provisional ballot, if you run into any issues, is that document that's going to ensure that, one, you get to cast your ballot, but then two, it provides time then for the elections officials to go back and examine whatever issue prevented you from casting a regular ballot.
In the first place.
And then they can check, and once they check and they're able to verify that everything was correct with respect to your registration, then that provisional ballot should be counted. And provisional ballots are to be counted by every jurisdiction that offers them. So that should be, in addition to calling the hotline and talking with lawyers, that should also be a way to ensure that members of the transgender community have their votes cast.
Okay. Here's another one from Electorate Spyglass. Love these handles. This person on Twitter says, are voters entitled to demand a manual paper poll? What happens when there's a voting station that only has an electronic voting booth?
That is really going to vary by jurisdiction. That's one of the beauties, if you will, of how the election system works in the United States. It is not a monolithic system. It is not as though the federal government says every state has to have the same kind of equipment and must have the same kind of ballot. So it is really going to vary depending on where that person lives. Again, I would urge that person to call the 1-866-R-VOTE hotline, because without knowing where that person is located, and frankly, even though I know a lot about the rules and regulations in many jurisdictions, I don't know about them all. But the best way is to call and ask to speak with someone who is well-versed on the rules and regulations in that particular jurisdiction and find out what their options are.
Okay, so we're running out of time, just time enough to get this one last comment in. This is from Scott Westerfield, who says, if you are in line, I love the little emojis in between for emphasis, if you are in line when the polls close and this is a police, this is authorities, they are legally required to let you vote. This is important information for people to know. So no matter what, let's say the polls close at 8, you were there at 6,
yes,
but the line is so long.
They have to allow you to stand in that line and cast your vote. Look, we saw this during the primary season. Maricopa County, Arizona. Unfortunately, Maricopa County cut down on the number of polling places that they had available during their primary. But there were voters who were in line before the clock struck on whatever the requisite closing time was. They had to stay there and honor those voters being in line. And voters stood in line, in some instances, up to 4 hours. I am hoping that will not be the case today. But if it is the case, if voters have the tenacity, and I hope they all do, and want to make sure they cast their ballot, as long as you are in line before the requisite closing time, those officials have to honor that, and they have to allow you to vote. And if for some reason you run into an issue and can't vote, my parting thought is call the 1-866-R-VOTE hotline, because lawyers will be on the ready to help you resolve any issues that you're facing.
And we've been flashing that number across our screens the entire time. So thank you so much. Luckily, it is sunny here in DC. Not a nice day. So even if you have to be there past closing time, it's not too bad. I wish warm and good weather for you all wherever you are. Keep your questions coming about the U.S. presidential election. The stakes are high. The tension is too. We've been watching from our studio about at 4 p.m. or 21 GMT. We'll be joined by political reporters that have been in the middle of the fray. So share your questions for them with #StreamElects. Until then, I want to thank my guests, Nicole, Alston, Hillary, and before that, Jessica Huseman, for being with us and answering your questions. And now, go out and vote.